Hi, everyone. My name is Eunice Kim, the Long Range Planning Manager with the City of Salem. Thank you so much for joining us today for a webinar on a 2024 code amendment. There are several staff here from the city, so I'm going to let them introduce themselves. Lisa, go ahead.
Hi there, Lisa Anderson Ogilvie of the city's planning administrator.
Hello there, Bryce Bishop with the Planning Division.
My name is Jacob Morris. I'm a historic planner with the City of Salem.
I'm Kimberly Fitzgerald, the Historic Preservation Program Manager with the city.
So just as a reminder, if you have questions, please drop them in the chat and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. So hopefully you can all see the screen. So the City of Salem is working on a code amendment 2024, and we periodically update the development code, the UDC, roughly every other year. And we try to do this to make sure that we can address new issues that have come up, new priorities as the community is growing and changing. We also want to make sure that we're implementing changes in state law and rules. And as issues come up that need clarification and corrections, we do that as well. The last time we did a major update of the UDC was in 2022. We both updated the code for the Our Salem project, which updated our comprehensive plan, as well as a big code update earlier in 2022. Today's code amendment really focuses on housing and encouraging housing development. As we all know, housing is a big issue, a big need in the City of Salem, so we're always looking for ways to promote housing development. So the code amendment really looks at helping promote housing development through several ways: by streamlining the approval process, by allowing more housing options, and by making it easier by revising standards that actually promote housing development. We're always, again, also looking to comply with new state laws and rules that come our way. So the first proposed change that I'm going to talk about today would allow adjustments to design standards. So today across the city, there's various areas of Salem where we have regulations that really regulate the design of sites and the design of buildings. There are design standards. This can be everything from requiring canopies and awnings, or regulating where parking can be located on a site. So in most of the areas across the city where we have these design standards, we allow people to do adjustments. I'll explain that in a second. But there's 3 areas currently that we don't allow adjustments. That's the West Salem Central Business Districts, which you can see on the map that's showing right now, as well as the Edgewater 2nd Street Mixed Use Corridor and the Portland Fairgrounds Overlay Zone. So again, these are the only areas in the city right now where we have design standards, and a person who is applying for a project can't apply for an adjustment when they can't meet a standard. So what does this all mean? So today, for example, if you're in one of those 3 zones or overlay, and say you cannot meet a standard related to providing awnings along the front of your building, if you can't meet that one standard, you are kicked into design review, where you need to now have a public hearing process. So this is an opportunity for the public to come and provide their testimony, and a decision is made on that project. This can often add time, money, and some uncertainty to a project. And so in recent years, what we have been doing as a city, as we've been shifting to allowing adjustments. So this is an administrative process, so it's approved at the staff level, but it still allows for opportunity for the public to comment, because we still provide public notice. This streamlines the approval process, and again, really aligns with how we've been shifting as a city to promote faster approvals, particularly as it relates to housing. So this proposed change, again, would address the West Salem Central Business District, Edgewater 2nd Street Mixed Use District, and the Portland Fairgrounds Road Overlay Zone. So the next proposed change is similar in that, again, it would allow for that administrative adjustment process to special uses that are residential. So today, for example, in the single family zone, if you want to develop a townhouse, it is considered a special use. So this is a use that is allowed by right, in the zone, so there's no public hearing process. But there are special standards for like building design or maybe setbacks that relate just to that specific use. So it's called a special use. Currently, if you are doing a townhouse or some of the other residential housing types, that's a special use. If you cannot meet one of those very specific special use standards, like a setback, for example, you then have to apply for a conditional use permit. So the conditional use permit, similar to the example before, was that you would have to go through a public hearing process. In recent years, we've been trying to, again, expedite the approval process. And so, for example, we have been making it easier to apply for adjustments. So if you cannot meet a special use standard for an accessory dwelling unit or middle housing, 2-family, 3-family, 4-family cottage clusters, for example, you can apply for this administrative approval. So this proposed change would allow for development like to a special use like a townhome to go through an adjustment process. I'm going to hand it over to Bryce, who's now going to talk about change to the process for historic.
Thank you, Eunice. So in terms of historic, the process today, specifically dealing with residential projects that either affect properties within a historic district or individually listed properties, there would be probably two major types of design review that would apply. The most common, that would be a class 1 minor historic design review and a class 2 major historic design review. And the way historic design review process works today, it's not necessarily whether or not you need to deviate from a standard or not. It's the process you go through depends on what you're doing to the historic resource in terms of, changing windows or changing the facade or and what facade you're changing. So if you're changing a main facade of a building that faces a primary street, that's going to, depending on the type of work you're doing on the building, that would kick you most likely into a major historic design review with the Landmarks Commission. And other types of changes could be minor, class 2 historic design review applications that are reviewed by staff through a notice process. But in order to streamline the process for housing developments, if you're doing new housing within historic districts or new housing on properties where there is a listed historic resource on it, we're changing the process a bit to establish a class 2 process, an administrative process where we send notice to neighbors and there's an opportunity to comment, but there is not an ability, but it doesn't go to the Landmarks Commission. So we're changing it to establish a baseline administrative staff review process for any project within a historic district or affecting a historic property where you're adding new housing as a result of the project. And it could be done by staff, and notice will go out and there would be an ability to appeal that decision. But it wouldn't automatically kick you up to a Landmarks Commission review, as would be the possibility today, depending on what you were doing. So we're streamlining the process in that respect. And then also we are allowing, like Eunice was speaking about, adjustments to standards, like those special use standards she was mentioning, that you can now do an adjustment to those standards. We're proposing a similar amendment for historic design review standards by also making those standards adjustable, specifically if they're being applied to a project that is developing new housing units. And so what's kind of unique with this set of amendments, though, is we're giving a lot of options for the applicant to choose from. So essentially, there's 4 main options that will be available to an applicant that's looking to do new housing on a historic property. Either they can choose to meet all of the standards and be subject to a staff administrative review, or they could choose to meet the standards, but maybe there's 1 or 2 that they don't meet. They could ask for an adjustment to those standards that they don't meet, and that would still be at a staff level review. But then they could also choose to, and this would be voluntarily up to their own choice. They could also kick it up to the Historic Landmarks Commission and have it subject to a class 3 major historic design review involving a public hearing, either based on the guidelines, historic design review guidelines included in the historic chapter, or based on the standards with an adjustment. So we really give a lot of options for either the applicant to go with a staff level review or a Landmarks Commission review. And so we feel that does will help meet the housing needs for folks that want to do new housing in residential districts and comply with the requirements of state law. And next slide, Eunice. And as part of that, as I mentioned, I'm allowing the adjustments to historic standards. The way it's structured right now, in the code, you can't adjust a historic standard. What you would do is if you don't meet a standard, you would go to the Landmarks Commission and your review would be based on the more flexible design guidelines. However, again, we are making the historic design review standards adjustable. And because the historic design review standards are very specific to how the buildings appears and how it fits within the context and character of the historic district, we wouldn't want necessarily just the normal staff to review them. So in this case, we're allowing either staff, Kimberly or Jake, to review adjustments to historic design review standards, or if it's going to with a class 3 major historic design review subject to the Landmarks Commission review, we're also allowing the Landmarks Commission to review adjustments. Today, again, the Landmarks Commission and the historic staff only review historic design review, but then this will be our first allowance of any other type of application beyond historic design review to be reviewed by historic staff and the Landmarks Commission, because they are the subject matter experts in terms of what it means to otherwise better or equally meet the intent of a specific historic design review standard that may be requested for adjustment by an applicant. So since they're the experts, we want to make sure that that adjustment and the historic design review application go together and they're reviewed by the folks that are best qualified to make those decisions. Next slide. Another aspect of the proposed amendments that we're looking at having approved are in terms of streamlining the review process for housing applications. And in this case, when we're looking at approval criteria for land divisions and site plan review for development in general, is to try to, where we can, eliminate those existing approval criteria in the code that deal with subdivisions, partitions, and site plan and class 3 site plan review that are discretionary. So under state law, we're required to have clear and objective standards for housing. And so when you look at our approval criteria for subdivisions and partitions, and a few of the approval criteria for site plan review today, they're not necessarily clear and objective. They use qualitative terms like minimize to the extent practical, or the design of the project considers things, and those are all red flags for judgment. And so in terms of housing applications, we're supposed to have clear and objective standards. So we went through the criteria for subdivisions, partitions, and class 3 site plan review, and we've identified those that are discretionary, and we're proposing to amend those or eliminate them as needed. And the reason we're comfortable with making these changes is because we already have blanket standards for each one of those application types that requires conformance with all of the applicable standards of the Unified Development Code and the Salem Revised Code. So when you look at the criteria that are proposed to be eliminated with this amendment, they're already otherwise covered by the standards that apply to the development that are included in such chapters like our streets chapter 803, which establishes requirements for street connectivity and sidewalk development and bike lanes and transit improvements, like chapters like 806, which have requirements for safe and convenient organization and layout of parking lots and driveways. Our tree ordinance, chapter 808, which establishes requirements for the preservation of trees and vegetation. Our landslide ordinance, which establishes requirements for development in areas that are subject to landslides, where there might be higher slopes or steeper slopes. And then our general development standards chapter, which has standards that deal with, for instance, pedestrian access through a site from building entrances to streets. So those standards in all of those chapters I just went through are essentially cover the bases of what those discretionary standards in the code today are trying to get at, but the standards in the code get to them in a more clear and objective manner. So it's best to get rid of the discretionary criteria and just have a criteria that requires just complying with the standards of the code. And then I'm going to kick it back to Eunice.
Great. So moving on from the process, we're now going to be talking a little bit about where we're going to allow housing in different areas. So currently today in our mixed use 1 and mixed use 2 zones, we don't allow single family and 2-family uses generally. Those zones are generally intended for higher density uses and for mixed use. But there are some smaller lots that are zoned mixed use 1, mixed use 2, for example, like on State Street and other areas, corridors, where those lots may not be big enough to allow 3 units, which are allowed in the mixed use 1 or 2 zones. They may only be big enough to allow 1 or 2 units. So this proposed change would allow 1 and 2 family units as long as they're part of a mixed use building. So this aligns with what we already allow in the mixed use 3 zone, which is a newer zone. So it promotes mixed use while still allowing for more options for providing housing in those mixed use 1 and 2 zones. In addition, today we allow accessory dwelling units, across the city, but they're generally allowed with a single family detached home or manufactured home. We currently do not allow accessory dwelling units with townhouses. So the proposed change would allow accessory dwelling units with townhouses up to two attached townhouses. So this provides more opportunity for ADUs, more opportunities for infill on smaller sites, and just generally allows more options for doing this type of housing across the city. Next, we are looking at making some small changes to our standards to promote middle housing. So today in the RM2 zone, the multiple family 2 zone, if you want to do 2 or 3 units on a lot, that lot needs to be 6,000 square feet in size. That's the minimum lot size. We are proposing to align it with the single family zone, the RS zone, where we currently allow 2 units on a 4,000 square foot lot and 3 units on a 5,000 square foot lot. So this proposed change would again make it so that a 2 and 3 family use could be allowed on those smaller lot sizes in the RM2 zone. Again, this would align it with what we already allow in our single family zone. So this promotes, more opportunities for smaller lots that are zoned RM2 to be developed with middle housing. Another change that we're proposing in this code amendment would implement the climate-friendly and equitable rules that came down from the state, I think a couple years ago now. So these rules really aim to promote walkable mixed-use areas, to promote more equitable communities, make it easier for people to walk around without having, or to get around without having to drive, essentially. And as part of those rules, it establishes minimum densities for walkable mixed-use areas. Those minimum densities are 15 units per acre in all areas except one. We have to have one area of the city that at least allows 25 units per acre. So currently, our central business district, basically our downtown area, is seeing the most dense development already, way beyond 20 units per acre. So this proposed change would increase the minimum density from 20 units per acre today to 25 units per acre. It would also establish a minimum density in our West Salem Central Business District. This is an area in West Salem where we are trying to promote more housing, more mixed use. This zone does not have any minimum density today. And so what would happen under this proposed code amendment is that it would have a minimum density of 15 units per acre. This is the same minimum density we have in most of our mixed use zones, so the mixed use 1, 2, and 3, as well as our multifamily zones. So this again aligns and promotes housing and really makes sure that we are using our land as efficiently as we can, particularly in the areas where we want to promote walkable areas and dense development. And now I'm going to pass it off to Jake.
Starting in 2023, the Historic Landmarks Commission reviewed multiple proposals for security gates or fencing within Salem's downtown historic district. Variation existed between the specific gates that were proposed in the different projects. Some were approved, some were not. They were all evaluated using the existing standards for storefronts and how that would impact visual character. But based on this, the HLC identified the need to establish clearer criteria that specifically address security gates within Salem's downtown historic district. And under Goal 2, which is streamlined historic code, criteria, process, and enforcement in the current historic preservation plan, and action item 6, which is based off of that, in their work plan, the HLC and historic preservation staff began working on improving and clarifying the historic code, as well as to develop some educational materials to teach historic property owners and tenants about the design review process. And these new standards for commercial security gates and fencing are the result of this effort. Next slide, please. The security feature standards apply to all buildings located within the downtown commercial historic district. They were developed through research of best practices found in other communities and also consultation with multiple stakeholder groups here in Salem. The standards are designed to strike a balance between added security, projecting a welcoming atmosphere, and protection of historic character. They're also designed to provide some flexibility to accommodate different types of security gates, while also being specific enough to avoid being arbitrary. A summary of the standards are as follows. The gate materials must be a traditional material that is historically compatible with the building and the district. It must minimize the overall visual impact on historic features and historic materials. It must be retractable so that when it's not in use, it has little or no visual impact. And then it also must not inhibit access during normal business hours. And these standards only apply to recessed alcove or entries. It was felt that if storefront windows were also shuttered, it would create too much of a sense of restraint and negatively impact the hospitality feeling that we like downtown. And with that, I'd like to turn it back over.
All
Bryce.
right. Thanks, Jake. So other changes. So the security fencing and gates, that is one area of design standards that apply very specifically in the downtown historic district, but broader, since the downtown historic district is in within the central business district zone and surrounded by the central, part of the central business district zone and surrounded by it. We want to establish greater, similarity and consistency where we can between the design standards that apply in the historic district and those that similarly would apply in the central business district zone in general. So security gates is one of those areas where on a couple slides ago was indicated that yes, this is not only for historic design review in the historic district, but also there's a slightly different version of the standards that are being included in the central business district zone as well. And obviously because the CB zone isn't within the general CB zone isn't within the historic district. The buildings don't necessarily have the same historic character, and so some of the criteria had to be different. But the bottom line is, if you look at the CB zone amendments that are included in this package, you'll see that there's also a corresponding set of security fencing gate standards that are tailored for buildings that are in the CB zone outside of the historic district. So that's one of the areas where we're establishing consistency and design standards between the historic district and the CB zone. And then in addition to that, another area is in canopies and awnings. So, today we've had in the code for years and years and years, going back to when the city first established our development design handbook, back in the late 90s for development within, past overlay zones in the downtown and other areas where we wanted to promote have weather protection along streets, along building facades next to streets, because we live in Oregon, it's rainy, obviously. So the weather protection provides, shade from the sun, protection from the rain and the wet months. And it's just really important for establishing a vibrant, pedestrian-friendly, active and inviting downtown. And so one thing we've lacked in the code, however, for many years is a minimum depth of the canopies and awnings. We do have a minimum clearance height above the sidewalk of 8 feet that's been in the code, since the beginning when we established these standards, but we never did have a minimum depth. So in looking at what is a feasible minimum depth, by looking at other projects that have been approved and what other jurisdictions require in the state, we landed at, requiring a minimum 6 foot of canopy depth for buildings where canopies and awnings are required. And so this minimum depth requirement is going to apply to all the zones, within the city and those remaining overlay zones that we have that have weather protection requirements. So minimum 8 feet clearance height above the sidewalk and that new minimum 6 foot of depth. And then that would apply within, the historic downtown historic district as well. And then the other, standard that we're establishing to establish consistency with the historic district is the CB zone today requires that building facades facing a street include a minimum of 90% weather protection along the building facade adjacent to the street. So as you can see in the picture here, pretty much these buildings have like 100% weather protection provided along their facade length as it is adjacent to the sidewalk. So the proposed amendment would add a requirement that buildings within the historic district similarly have that 90% minimum, canopy and awning provision, but it's only going to apply to new construction because if we applied it to existing buildings that were already constructed in the district, that could create a situation where the canopy and awning is maybe inconsistent with the historic context of the building and therefore would be incompatible with the building in terms of how it was originally constructed. So we're not applying it to the 90% standard to existing buildings, but if you're doing new construction within the historic district, and a great example would be the Holman Hotel, which was in the downtown historic district or is in the historic district, they didn't have that 90% standard, but I believe they are pretty close to have been meeting that regardless of the case. So for any new construction, we want to make sure that we get that 90% weather protection standard like other buildings in the CB zone would have to adhere to. Next slide. And a third area where we're establishing greater similarity between the standards between the downtown historic district and the CB zone are the requirements for ground floor windows. So in the CB zone, we have a requirement, and many of our overlay zones as well, and our mixed use zones about having ground floor transparent windows to promote that active and inviting pedestrian environment. So you can look into the building and see what's going on rather than blank facades next to the street. So in terms of wanting to make sure we establish that same character in the downtown historic district, where there isn't a specific percentage today, we are requiring the same percentage for new construction in the historic district for ground floor windows that currently is required for development in the CB zone. And so today it's a 65%, 65% of the ground floor facade would have to have transparent windows. And so that CB zone standard would also apply again only to new construction within the historic district, because again, if we applied it to existing buildings and structures within the district, it could create a situation where, the ratio of like the solid mass of the building to the void of the building where the windows are, it may be incompatible with the historic, design of the building and therefore could make it not compatible. So again, the 65% required amount of windows would only apply to new construction to be consistent with the CB zone. But then we also are going to look at applying a minimum transparency requirement, in the CB, in the downtown historic district for windows. And that's to ensure that people can see through the windows, as is kind of the intent to have, windows on the ground floor facade. And so when throughout the city where we have the ground floor window requirements, except today in the historic district, we have a minimum transparency of 37% visible light to be able to transmit through the windows. So we're applying that same minimum 37% visible light transmittance standard to new construction and existing buildings within the downtown historic district to establish that consistency. And then last slide here. And those design changes, in the historic district and the CB zone, those aren't really related to housing per se, because as Eunice indicated at the very beginning of the presentation, this does also include other amendments that are kind of cleanups and changes to the code to address issues that have arisen since the last amendment. And so some other changes that we are proposing to make with this amendment are allowing small animal veterinary services and pet grooming services in the downtown, in the central business district zone. And this is really, the need for this amendment is really coming to light when we have more folks that are living in the downtown now through promotion of housing and trying to get folks to live in the downtown. And so people have pets, obviously, and what better way to make it convenient for people to live in the downtown if there is a place for them to take, their animals to go to the vet, to get checked up, or to go get them, groomed. So we're proposing to allow small animal vet services and pet grooming as a permitted use in the CB zone. If you're going to do vet or pet grooming in the downtown, in the CB zone, though, it's going to have to be in an enclosed building. We're not talking about there being animal runs, outside dog runs and things where, animals are running around barking and creating kind of maybe a ruckus that wouldn't be consistent with the downtown environment. But we are allowing it if it's in a completely enclosed building. And then a couple changes that we're also making to the requirements for gravel parking areas or storage areas in the IG zone. Today, gravel parking in the IG zone specifically exempts the only vehicle storage areas from paving requirements. We're broadening that to make it more inclusive, I think, of the intent of the IG zone. The IG zone is our most intense industrial zone where you have, you know, manufacturing uses and places where pallets are being stored outside, equipment is being stored outside. And so instead of requiring, you know, those areas, those storage areas to be paved because they're part of a vehicle use area, we're looking to expand the exemption for paving to not only vehicle storage, but also just any outdoor storage. And the idea. Sorry, I kind of lost connection there. So I'm back, everybody. So hopefully, you know, you can hear me. But in
We can hear you.
addition, okay, cool, awesome. So in addition to, you know, exempting, you know, vehicle storage areas and just storage areas in general in the IG zone from paving, we are going to require, because paving is considered a hard surface, or gravel is considered a hard surface for stormwater standards under the city's code, development code, that site plan review be required if you're establishing a gravel, you know, storage area. So appropriate stormwater management and capacity design, filtration and detention can be established with projects where you are looking to do gravel surfaces in the IG zone. And so yeah, so that'll give a little bit more flexibility. And with that, you know, even though people might think gravel's terrible, and this is the IG zone again, the most impactful, you know, and intense industrial zone we have, but we are also clarifying the setbacks that apply in, you know, for gravel areas in the IG zone. So if you're going to do a gravel area, you still have to meet your perimeter landscaping and setbacks, you know, along the street to kind of buffer it from the street. And you also would have to provide a minimum 5-foot setback for the gravel area if it's next to another zone that's not industrial general. So if it was like next to a commercial retail zone or something, the gravel lot would have to be set back and landscaped from those abutting zones that aren't IG. But if you're an IG zone abutting another general industrial IG zone, there wouldn't be a setback requirement from the perimeter. There would just be a setback requirement and a landscaping requirement along the street. So that wraps up that slide.
So we will answer any questions you all have, but as a reminder, we have a joint public hearing with the Planning Commission and the Historic Landmarks Commission on June 11th, where they will be hearing this proposed code amendment. If you have any comments, you can email them to me. Bryce, Jake, Kimberly, and I are all working on the code amendment, but I will be collecting the comments and helping respond to them. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen to see if there are questions. I think Lisa's going to go through them. One second.
Yeah, and there are a couple questions. So the first one is, mixed use can sometimes be problematic for commercial leases. Would residential use be permitted in some cases if business or commercial uses were not achieved?
I think that's probably me. So in our mixed use zones, we do allow standalone residential if you have at least 3 units. That's how the mixed use zones are currently structured. So even in the central business district downtown, mixed use 1, 2, and 3, you can do standalone residential because those are meant to be flexible zones. Proposal though is, so because today we don't allow a 1 family, a single family, or a 2 family, like a duplex in those zones, we want to be careful that our mixed use zones, which again are meant for a mix of uses in higher density, don't become like a single family zone. And so we're only proposing to allow 1 or 2 units if it's combined with some other non-residential use. I hope that answers the question.
Great. Next question is on windows. So maybe for Bryce, on the first floor and light visibility, it stated that 37% visible lights required. What if those in the space do not want people to look in, such as an exercise business that may want privacy? May they have full screening on the windows when a class is in session?
So I think, you know, the best way to answer that is we don't want anything that's permanent that, you know, blocks the visibility. So what we've talked about with applicants in the past is if you had curtains or shades or blinds that you can install on the windows. So like if that exercise class is in session, they could close the blinds, close the curtains, and you know, block up visibility for privacy. But then afterwards, when there isn't that concern for privacy, they could open them up again.
Great. The next question is, when will we be able to see the revised portions of the code that will be considered for adoption?
They are currently online on our legislative land use proposals page. I will drop a link to the that page in the chat.
Great. Next question for staff level review, are there published specific criteria for review? Or maybe that's for Bryce.
Yeah, so like for all of our application types, and I don't know, Steve, if you're referring to the standards for the land division, subdivisions, partitions, and site plan review, or if you're like trying to get at the historic. But all of those standards and criteria, those are in the chapters. So if it's historic, and the staff level, criteria for those types of reviews, if they're staff level for new housing in a historic district, it would be in chapter 230. And the historic design review standards are in there, and they're the existing standards that are in there today. We're not proposing to change any of those historic standards that apply in 230. We're just allowing those projects to be reviewed based on new housing projects in a historic district to be reviewed based on those standards rather than having to go to the Landmarks Commission. And then if it's the site plan review or land division criteria, those are in chapter 205, our land division code. So those are, the criteria are under a specific section. Often it's, sub-criteria D of each one of those, sections of the code that deal with the different land division types. But then the standards of the code that we apply, those are, throughout each chapter of the code. So when I was referring to a criteria that applies in subdivisions, subdivisions, partitions, and site plan review, the first criteria is always the application meets all applicable standards of the code. So, we go through and identify. So if you're doing a land division, we obviously look at the zone that it's in and what are the standards for lot size and dimensions. And, land divisions have streets that are involved. So we look at our streets chapter, and then we identify the applicable provisions of the streets chapter in terms of connectivity, right-of-way width, improvement width, and apply those to the application. With land divisions, there's a tree conservation plan involved. So we look at the requirements of chapter 808 for tree preservation. And so we apply those standards to the code. So those are all published in the code.
And if you're
Yeah.
referring,
No, go ahead.
when we were talking about changing some of the public hearing conditional use, for example, to an adjustment for like the special uses, the adjustment criteria are in the adjustment chapter, which is 250. So there are specific criteria that staff uses to approve those if you're referring to adjustments.
And Bryce, Steve had a follow-up. Does the clear and objective standards update cover the standards that were not available for Titan Hill, for which City Council said they had no authority to take action? I know you weren't involved in Titan Hill.
No.
I'm trying to think of, so I pulled up the code that Eunice linked to, and just looking at the subdivision criteria as I'm thinking about your question, Steve. And it's kind of what Bryce said, like there's a standard right now that the subdivision takes into account topography, vegetation, and such that the least disruption of the site will result. And that's not a clear and objective standard, right? So we do have tree protection, we have grading standards, we have other standards that we apply. If somebody meets all those standards, then it's hard to say, well, are they taking into account the least disruption? And that's where I think City Council and staff both have kind of struggled with us not having the clear and objective, because the standard could mean anything to anybody, really. So I think the answer to your question is yes. That's what we're attempting to do. So hopefully we get there. You also had a follow-up question about gravel surfaces. What about forever chemicals, groundwater pollution, for which EPA has new regulations to deal with? Will stormwater requirements be updated?
Not with this code amendment. We're not looking to change stormwater, but I believe Public Works is working on amendments to the stormwater, code. But I don't know what to the extent that those would address, requirements for forever chemicals and EPA compliance.
But stormwater would still be required, right? I think it's right now 10,000 square feet, and it's going to be reduced to 5,000 square feet, I believe.
Yeah.
Gravel. Yeah.
Yep. And so and by requiring site plan review for that gravel surface, that is a way for us to ensure that when that gravel surface comes in, it's being reviewed for conformance with the stormwater standards.
And that's the last question. Anybody else have any questions? Feel free to type it in. Oh, yes, that Counselor Nishioka said new stormwater requirements are in the works. Yeah, I believe it will finish up soon. And I think Robin Dalkey is the lead on that in development services.
So if there aren't any other questions, we will wrap up the webinar. Again, so we are having a joint, oh. Okay, looks like there's more questions. Okay, we will be having a joint public hearing again at the Historic Landmarks Commission and Planning Commission on June 11th. Where we will be presenting this to them and answering questions and giving feedback. And if you have any comments or questions, feel free to email me directly or feel free to give me a call. Happy to walk through any of this with you. So with that, thank you for taking the time to come to this webinar.
Yeah, thank you,
Appreciate
everybody.
it.
Thanks.